Most video games give their players some kind of pushback, whether it's aggressive enemies, large gaps to cross, or a devilish brain teaser. For horror games, and specifically horror focused on exploration and atmosphere, spooky creatures wandering dark halls is often the pushback that these games rely on. Which makes sense, doesn't it? After all, it's hardly a horror game if there's no monsters, right? Okay, fine, it can be done, but more often than not, horror is gonna throw some creepy creature your way and expect you to evade it using your wits, the surrounding environment, and maybe a gun if you're lucky. And as you might have guessed, my game is no different. However, where my game differs from others is the way monsters inform the game's narrative, as well as giving each creature a unique mechanic that sets them apart not just from each other, but from the many other monsters in the horror genre. This past month, I've been working on making a new level in my game, and in doing so, I thought now would be a good time to walk you through my monster making process using this new monster I've created. Now, this video is going to be more of an overview of monster creation. There's a lot to talk about between animating a monster, coding its unique behaviors, or designing levels around its abilities that could probably all be their own videos. But for the sake of time, we're just going to focus on the broad strokes today, and maybe go in depth on the individual aspects in a future devlog. With that said, hello! My name is Lance, working under the name Infinite Level, and I am making a psychological horror game called What Hides in Dreams, where death leaves scars. Let's start from the very beginning. Design is the first stage of monster creation, and arguably the most important. Plenty of monsters in games will have a general gameplay purpose that can apply to all monster encounters, because all they'll do is wander the area and be spooky, then give chase if they see the player. One of the main selling points of my game, on the other hand, is the unique mechanic assigned to each encounter. Now, this doesn't mean there can't be overlap. Multiple monsters that all rely on the same base routine of wandering an area and looking for the player is fine, but they need to have some extra something to set them apart. Take this monster, for instance, who I call the Machine. On the surface, he doesn't really do anything all that special, but you'll notice there's a bunch of workers around that can alert the monster to your presence. Plus, the workers will also chase you if the main monster is actively pursuing you, which can lead to situations where you get surrounded by the main monster and one or two of his underlings. I'd say I basically made a spooky version of Pac-Man, but Bandai Namco seem to already be doing that themselves. In the case of this new monster I'm making, he also uses the basic routine of stalking the area, but he himself is blind, and can only see the player if they step into the light of these eyes here. What say we do a little demonstration? Oh, and he moves fast too, forgot to mention that. After I settle on monster mechanics, I then design a level with its abilities in mind, considering the monster's special behavior and planning the map so that the player has to contend with said behavior. And the end result is, hopefully, an interesting monster encounter. There's also the narrative aspects of a monster. If you're new here, and I wager that you are given that I'm still very much a small fry YouTuber with less than 1,000 subscribers, hint hint, then you should know that when I say death leaves scars when talking about this game, I am referring to the way the game's story changes when the player is killed by a monster, or if the player kills the monster. With that in mind, it's important that each monster carries some narrative significance. My game takes place inside a dream, and the story revolves primarily around how the main character views the world around him, which means that the monsters in question are highly symbolic. Sometimes it's in really obvious ways. For instance, this monster is called the Wife, and gee, I wonder who that could be about. But on the other hand, there's this monster I'm creating now who is called the Eyes, which might seem ironic for a blind monster, but don't forget, it has eyes everywhere. In other words, this is about how the protagonist feels like everyone around him is watching him and how that makes him feel. And that symbolism is meant to feed right back into the design of the monster and its unique mechanics. Story informs gameplay, and gameplay informs story. So we've got the monster's design and its narrative purpose, so now we get to the actual monster creation, beginning with modeling and animating. Now, a smarter game dev than I would have drawn up some concept art or design sheets to give themselves or their artist something to work with as they model. But I am not a smart game dev, so I instead create my monsters entirely through my mind's eye. In fairness, they're all basically humanoids with some freaky feature or two, so they're not exactly complicated. And as a solo dev, I don't need to communicate what they're supposed to look like to anyone else. So in this case, going off of mind's eye is okay, if not exactly ideal. Modeling begins with this handy tool called Make Human, where I simply move some sliders around to get a human model in the rough shape that I want. I'll then take that human model and import it into Blender to use it as a base for the rest of the model. In the case of the eyes, I'll take this basic human, give him some claws, open up his stomach a bit, and replace his head with whatever this is. This monster has some additional models involved in its creation, most of them made from scratch by yours truly for this character. However, I did get this human skull mesh from Base Mesh, a website dedicated to offering several meshes free of charge for use in games and more. Put it all together, assign some textures as needed, and you get this lovely chap. If it sounds simple, it's because I've taken a lot of shortcuts to make it so. I'm a programmer, first and foremost, so the art of making, well, art isn't exactly a natural process for me. For as all programmers know, one of the laws of the universe states that to be a programmer, you must also suck at art. So I use these tools to help myself out and make something that would be of better overall quality than if I had done every element completely from scratch. Of course, that's not the end of the visual part of monster making. I now need to animate this monster because having the monster A pose at you while moving looks a bit goofy, even if it does show dominance. Once again, I rely on a special tool to speed up the process, a Blender plugin by the name of Auto Rig Pro, which handles the rigging part of animating a 3D model. Rigging, for those who don't know, is basically setting up controls to move different parts of the model, such as the arms or eyes, for the purpose of animation. This plugin does a lot of the setup work for you, so I couldn't actually tell you how to rig a model from scratch. Heck, I'm still not entirely sure what all these colored balls mean, but I know enough to make things move, and that's the goal at the end of the day. With this plugin, I just give a few details such as the locations of shoulders and wrists, and tell the plugin what model to assign this rig to, and presto, I have a model ready for animation. From there, it's a tedious process of assigning keyframes by manipulating rig controls to pose the model in the way you want, then stringing those keyframes together to make an animation. A pretty basic explanation of what I'm doing here, but hopefully it's enough info to make sense. And if it doesn't make sense, well, don't feel bad because I barely comprehend it myself. Rigging a model makes it easier to bend joints in realistic ways, usually, and is a big part of how this process runs smoothly. You can set keyframes for the entire rig, or choose keyframes for individual parts if you want, say, the head to do its own thing while everything else sticks with the established timeline. You'll also notice that some parts of the monster model are missing during this process, and that's because sometimes when rigging a model for animation, the rig will try a little too hard to keep everything together relative to the part being moved, resulting in some weird stretching and contorting from objects that aren't technically part of the main body. You can clean this up in Blender itself, but it's quite a hassle in my experience, and I found that 9 times out of 10 I can export the individual mesh into Unreal Engine by itself and reattach it to the rest of the monster in Engine for an overall better result. From there, it's a matter of going down a monster's animation checklist and making all necessary animations. Every monster at least has an idle, walk, run, and death animations, and then additional animations are created based on that monster's needs. Sometimes those additional animations are strictly to make a monster scare you a little, and other times it's for legitimate gameplay purposes. Regardless, once all the animations are made, it's time to export the monster, and then I finally make my way into Unreal Engine. For the coding part of this process, I have a base monster script that's applied to every monster in the game, and our long-necked boy here is no exception. This base code is what gives the monster the basic routine of stalking an area and chasing the player on detection. It also sets up several parameters that I can edit on a per monster basis, such as how fast it moves or the sound effects it plays. That's all done in C++, and barring the occasional addition of a new parameter or function, has largely been complete since the early days of What Hizen Dreams its development. To implement the eye's exclusive behaviors, I use Unreal Engine's blueprint system, which effectively expands on the base monster script with additional code exclusive to this monster. This is where I specify what to do when the player has entered the line of sight of one of those special eye objects, as well as some special instructions regarding what to do when the monster is defeated by the player and vice versa. This is also typically where I handle any logic for horror events involving this monster, like an introduction scene. I've got a dedicated map that I use for testing the monster out, so I plop the monster in there and have it do stuff until I've proven to myself it is reasonably competent at its job. Some of the parameter values and details of its unique logic might change in the final level, but for the present moment I'm happy with how it's come together and move on to the next stage of monster creation, which means leaving Unreal Engine and setting up my microphone. During testing, I use some placeholder sounds for the monster to make as I test its AI, but obviously it needs its own unique sound effects at some point. There are plenty of resources for sound effects across the internet, whether it be on asset stores or on Freesound, but for monsters it feels important to make original sounds from scratch, which means setting up the very mic I'm talking into now and making funny noises into it. For monster sounds, it's really just a matter of making sounds with my mouth and then applying filters and effects to give it that monstrous tone. For the eyes monster, all I did was curl my tongue over my bottom teeth, made this sound, and then experimented with edits until I eventually ended up with this. And experimentation really is the key element here. It took me nearly an hour just to come up with a bass noise to make with my own vocals, and then another hour just experimenting with effects and coming up with something I like. And that's how it's gone for every monster, but I do think the result is worth it. It can be really awkward making ridiculous noises into a microphone, especially when you know your wife is upstairs probably hearing every bit of it and wondering what kind of bizarre kink content you're creating. But on the other hand, it's the best excuse you have for making stupid noises like this and turning it into something kinda neat. So, take the good with the bad. The last major step in monster creation is building the level it will inhabit, and building a level is definitely something that will have to be its own devlog sometime. But in the context of monster creation, this is where I typically settle on logic for horror events and cutscenes, and fine-tune some of the details that were tested in my test map. This way, I can be assured that the monster is ultimately configured correctly for the level it's meant to occupy. I first block out the level, basing it off the level design drawing I've made, but will often have to move things around as I go because I'll run into a problem I didn't think about when drawing the map design. After blocking it out, I'll add in any necessary code to get the level playable, then insert the monster and play through it a few times to make sure the level feels right. It's gonna look ugly, but prettying it up will come later. I then make tweaks, adjustments, and even outright cuts and additions as needed, and then playtest again, and generally repeat that process until the level works. I'll try to incorporate horror events into this process too, but I don't always worry about that at this stage. It sort of depends on how necessary it is for the gameplay feel. But in general, horror events tend to come later, after building up the level and testing out the monster. Once it all feels satisfactory, it's just a matter of making things look nice, fixing bugs, adding story notes, and general polish. And even then, there's always a good chance I'll come back at a later time and do even more stuff with the level, but for the sake of this video, that is the basic steps to building out a level for a monster to inhabit. And that's the monster creation process in a nutshell. As I said, any one of those parts can be videos on their own, and perhaps one day they will be. But hopefully this gives you a general idea of what needs to be done to bring a monster to life. I would say the parts I tend to spend the most time on is the modeling and animating, probably because that's the area with the most stuff needed, and the stuff in question takes a decent chunk of time to make, at least for me. Imagine how much longer it'd take without all the tools I have helping me out. This game would never get done. Speaking of getting done, this example monster and the level he's associated with has been the focus of my work lately, and as of this writing, this level is getting pretty close to being complete. I'll most likely be returning to working on the game's demo after this level is done. That might end up being a good time to go over specific parts of this game's development in more detail. So if you like this video and you're curious to see more in the future, then I would highly recommend you subscribe to the channel. So far, I've got a good habit of uploading videos on the first of the month, or thereabouts, and I intend to maintain that habit so you'll always have something to look forward to each month. Likes are always appreciated, of course, and for those who hated every second of this video yet somehow sat through the whole thing, there's a dislike button that you can press to make your voice heard. There, see? Look how accommodating I am. But most importantly, if What Hides in Dreams looks interesting to you at all, then I would love it if you wishlisted the game on Steam. Wishlists are how Steam gauges interest in a game and helps get the game out in front of more people come release day. And you'll receive an email notification whenever the finished game releases. Link is in the description below. Thank you for watching, have a pleasant day, and until next time.